All right, welcome everybody who's watching live on Facebook, or maybe watching this via replay, or might even be listening to this on our audio podcast. This is the Ilovetowatchyouplay.com podcast with Dr. Sam and Yar, and I am our host today, Dr. Sam and Yar, and we have a very special guest, Dr. Adam Beard, who is the high performance director with the Chicago Cubs. A little background on Adam. He has worked with athletes in several continents and countries, from Australia to the UK to the Middle East to the United States, and has worked with everything from obviously professional baseball to the NFL, Australian rules football. I believe you guys call that footy out in Australia, right?
Yeah.
And a whole bunch of other sports in between. And so tons of experience across the globe, and with lots of athletes working in sports science and in high performance. And so we're really thrilled to have you today, Adam.
Hey, thanks for having me, Sam.
I'm hoping that, this is just an organic conversation and a discussion. I do have a few questions that to get us started, but we'll just see where it goes, Adam, and feel free to, share whatever you think would be helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, happy to share whatever.
Awesome. So let's start with, what high performance directors, at least in the States, is a relatively new thing. And even quote unquote sports science. So talk to us, what does that mean? What does a high performance director do? And what do we mean by high performance? And what do we mean by sports science?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is new in the States. It's probably a little bit more kind of ingrained in probably Australia, Europe, and especially the USSR, or, it used to be the former USSR, with their sporting, developments. Look, the title is high performance. So obviously we want to maximize performance. This high performance director in the States, there's a lot of kind of debate on what it is, but realistically it is, for the organizations that are doing it well, is someone to oversee all of the different departments. So that being physical and mental. So I oversee 5 departments, that being strength and conditioning, athletic training, medical, sports science, nutrition, and psychology, mental skills. So it's trying to maximize performance of both the coaches and players through a holistic lens.
Great. So I'd imagine with those different disciplines you mentioned, that must be challenging sometimes to get everybody on the same path and see the same vision and work together.
It is. I'm dealing with some really good experts. Take your experience. I'm not as experienced in psychology as yourself. So how do I get people who are a lot smarter in different areas on the same page? And realistically, we grab that vision from here is our president and our manager, and then we construct how can we support that. So, let's face it, a good analogy is, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. My job is to make sure everybody does not look through only their lens, but how can the other sub-departments really help get the best out of our players and coaches.
Sure. So, having been in multiple countries and worked with multiple sports, what are some differences that you've seen, good or bad, working with sports in the U.S. compared to some of the other places you've been?
Yeah, wow, good question. I think the people are the same. Like, athletes are all want to get better and that sort of thing. Your best players are going to work harder. They're going to stack good habits and that sort of thing. It's probably the different systems. So take the US, because of our population here, it's almost like elimination. You go through kind of, if you don't make the Pee-wees, you're probably not going to make the next level and the next level. So people are kind of eliminated throughout. We tend not to have late developers as much in some of our systems. Whereas in, let's say, Australia, the population's a lot smaller, so they probably cater a little bit more for the later developers. So I'm not saying that late developers can't make it in the US, and I'm not saying that, late developers always make it in Australia, but they're probably the bigger things is the system. So like college sport in the US is a much bigger deal than a lot of other countries. You don't tend not to have that in Europe. You tend not to have that in Australia. So college is very, very important for the pathway to the top in the States. So more the systems than the people, I think. Look, culturally, the Middle East, very religious. So, the guys would and I was only allowed to work with men there. Prayer 6-7 times a day. So, you had to kind of cater for that around it. So I just think communication with different cultures and being sensitive to people's beliefs has been a big one too.
Sure. So with sports science and high performance being relatively new in the U.S. compared to some of the other places you've been, what sort of resistance or skepticism or questions have you encountered as you come to the States?
I guess because it's not as ingrained in the States, you have a lot of guruism or a lot of uneducated opinions. And that's probably the big one of trying to educate my stakeholders, be that the GM, be that the head coach, is they've had a snippet of some of these things. But I think it's trying to be transparent and honest of, look, sometimes you may have heard these things. And I think we're going through that as there's the pandemic, the coronavirus is, you can go to Twitter or Instagram or Facebook to get kind of your education, or you can go through science. And that's sort of the process that I adopt.
Yeah, having known you for several years now, I know that the no gurus is a big thing for you.
Yeah, it is. It is. We've got players that are on hundreds of millions of dollars, so they've obviously got a team. They're almost like a CEO of themselves. So probably, since I came to the States back in 2015, I've changed my process for dealing with gurus, and I try and talk to them as well these days in terms of trying to educate them for the best for the players. In the end of the day, it's not about me. It's not about the guru. It's about the player. So.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the player. I think that's a great segue. Something you had said earlier was that stereotypically the U.S. is, more about elimination and not as many late bloomers. And we want to talk to our audience today about how do we maximize the performance of mostly their kids who are listening. We probably have some coaches listening as well. But so we're mostly talking about youth athletes, middle school, high school. So how do we maximize their performance? Do you have any? Let's just start generally. Are there tips that you have that you'd like to throw out there from an educated, science-based approach?
Yeah, no. I think with sport, you tend to get athletes. So if we're trying to maximize their performances, what is their strengths? You tend to really enjoy your strengths, and I think with a lot of this high performance and sports science is we mitigate that. We can easily turn a lion into like a zebra as such, and put them in the pack. But I think that, to the parents, to the coaches is enhance that specialty of that player. And I think that's, if you're just always working on your weaknesses and not your strengths or your physical gifts, then you tend to lose enjoyment. But then also, what makes that player special and enjoyment. So I think that's a big thing.
Sure.
There's the Tiger Woods kind of versus Roger Federer. You know what I mean? Like I think Epstein put it in his book Range, and I think that was a really cool lesson of early specialization versus kind of getting that range and breadth. And I think our players, I'm seeing at the moment, injuries and different things, is the bandwidth for performance is very small, and we want our kids to do a lot more bandwidth. So, experience climbing trees. There's, people are worried about that these days, and we want to give them, those experiences and different sports and cultures and that sort of thing. So,
sure. So accentuate or leverage strengths. Sounds like
Yep.
be a kid and be well rounded. It sounds like is some advice that you have. Any other general tips? I know we'll get into some specifics in a little bit.
Yeah, I think goal setting is a big one. Like teaching players to goal set, short term, medium term, long term, because I think it can understand their why. We tend to have players in our minor league system, and you sit down with them and you ask them the goal, and of course the goal is the major league. But what is the goal today? Like how can you view a session? And it's very easy. Hey, win the session, but what is winning the session for that player?
Right. What does that mean?
Yeah, and I'd encourage that. I think that's a really important one. So
I like what you're saying because it reminds me of a conversation I had with another sports science director, and he had said he came from the UK, and he said, you have more athletes in Dade County, Florida, than we have in all of England, and the problem is that of this elimination that you talked about, to use your word, Adam, and that there's not enough focus on development. Either if the player doesn't work out, they're gone, and we'll just go because the pool is so large. We'll go and we'll get the next player. And what I love that you're talking about development and helping them day to day improve, but also leverage their strengths.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important. And I used to say that at the NFL, straight after the season, they go into a very specific phase. And I would tend to tell the players, go and work on what made you special. Is it strength? Is it power? Is it speed? Is it technique? Like that's the window. We'll get you conditioned in kind of, the off-season program. But yeah, work on what makes you special. And I think that's really important.
Great. So let's dive into some more specific things. And if you're listening live and you have questions, feel free to type them in the Facebook Live, and we'll ask Dr. Beard your question. All right. So one question I have a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old, and one question I've always had is, at what age should kids start strength training, and then what should they start with? What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, great question. I think there's some really good position papers at the moment. Rodri Lloyd out of the UK, Avery Friedenberg from the US here was a pioneer in terms of that. Kyle Pierce. So I would put in those searches and that sort of thing. Dealing with the kids in the Middle East, we talent identified them from like 10, and we brought them in. I think the body doesn't process resistance training different. So everyone goes, hey, we'll just do body weight. But if you do certain body weight, so i.e. a push-up, that's 2/3 of your body weight. Whereas if you had a dumbbell that's at 5 pounds, it's much, much smaller resistance. So I do think that, you can start, even Olympic weightlifting really, really young if you're doing it skill-based. So it might be with an aluminum bar or with, a dowel rod. I think you can start kind of, 10 at least. So I would encourage you more skill-based type things. What are we preparing for? Are we preparing for soccer? So, if we're preparing for soccer, de-accelerations, accelerations, are really hard on the body. It's like 2, 3, 4 times body weight. So, but in saying that, so you might go squatting, someone might say, hey, well, that's 2 or 3 times body weight. De-acceleration, we'll just put that on the young adolescent's back. And we have a growing spine. So I would reduce that, the spinal loads. But I think you can start very young. I would just encourage people to go and see a qualified coach.
Sure.
And that's probably the big thing. Same with every.
What advice would you give for finding a qualified coach? What credentials should you be looking for?
Yeah. Here in this country, the NSCA has the Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist. there's a lot of great coaches at that high school level and that sort of thing. I think you can definitely find them on their website. You can find their coaches, the RSCC, so the Registered Strength and Conditioning Coach. That means that they've got, their CPR, but they've also got their qualifications of a degree plus the certification thing. And I think those people are out there. So
great. Okay. So you mentioned soccer. So let's say I have a kid who's trying to improve. What I loved you talking about was skill specific. So I want to go with that for a moment. So let's say they want to improve the force at which they can drive a soccer ball. They want to hit it harder and with more pace. So what might your suggestion be? How do they work on that?
Yeah,
type of exercises.
Yeah, look, I think some resistance training could be good, some jump training, but then also the skill. So, it's very easy to increase put a bigger engine in a car, but then you have to get that coordination to drive it. And I think coordination is a big one for us, is in terms of analyzing the skill of how does that leg, go with the plant leg? And then the swing leg, like, is it a timing? Is that plant leg, are you collapsing? What joints? So that could give you, so if you're collapsing at the knee joint, for instance, then you might have knee dominated strength training or resistance training or jumping to give you stiffness around that joint. Look, I can give you really basic ones just to increase the strength, but I think you can kind of have a look at what's negating the player from being able to drive that ball.
So what I love about what you're saying is, to go full circle, you talked about if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but you're looking at it very holistically. So there's the strength demands, but there's also the biomechanical things. I'd argue there's a mental component as well. What are they thinking every time they go to strike the ball, right? What's happened in the past? There's a recovery and a training load aspect. So really what you're saying is you have to look at the whole picture and then do everything very purposefully when you're trying to improve some aspect of your game.
Yeah. And the advice I'd give a coach or a parent, to film something and then go through a checklist. Okay, so what's negating, their child or, who they're coaching to perform that better? And absolutely, the psychology is a big one. It really is, because, you see these kids in practice against, no opposition, drive the ball really, really well, and then against opposition. So, there's that aspect.
Sure.
Anxiety, all those things. So.
I hit the golf ball great at the driving range, but when I get out onto the course with my friends watching, it's a different game, right? So you're right. How you practice dictates how you play in the right circumstances.
Yeah, okay, I think that's a good one. Like, perfect practice doesn't make perfect performance. You have to learn. The body actually learns much better from mistakes. It's actually a really self-organizing organism. So, if you can say, for instance, in running, you may coach the head. Okay, let's make sure your head's at the same spot. Then the body organizes itself to make sure that you maintain the head at that height. So be it stiffness at the ankle, strength at the knee, that sort of thing.
So it's okay to fail in practice. In fact, we want that to happen.
We do. Learning's accelerated, but there has to be a successful outcome or the ability to show what you're actually coaching. A mistake for a mistake is not conducive of performance.
Right.
But, controlled mistakes or mistakes that can lead to better performances is definitely encouraged. Sure.
And then having that growth mindset along with that certainly can help protect our egos as well.
No doubt. The growth mindset's a really big one.
Sure. So, all right, we talked a little bit about strength training. Let's talk about recovery. So again, most of our listeners, middle school, high school, perhaps, they'll go to a volleyball tournament and play 3, 4, 5 matches in a weekend, soccer tournament, or maybe they're a football player who is playing a game a week. Give us some, you know, realistic, hands-on tips for recovery between games, whether it's a tournament or even if you're playing regularly once a week, twice a week, that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, it's a good one. It's a really good question. I think you've got to start at your fundamentals. So that being nutrition. You can do a nice kind of trendy ice bath or cryotherapy, or like what Steph Curry's doing, or LeBron, or whatever. But realistically, nutrition is a big one. You can't have processed carbs and different things between games and expect to recover, because we know that impacts things like sleep. Sleep is cheap, but actually it's not. A lot of people tend to do all the wrong habits before sleep. Like, sleep is a massive one. So, you go from these games, and we get a lot of our players, so they're sympathetic driven, that fight or flight, or they're up for the game, and then they never let their parasympathetic, that rest digest, come back in. So their minds are back on. So straight away you see the young adolescents come off the field and they're straight on their phone. So they're playing games and stuff like that. So they're already up already. So it's almost like, how can we come down from the game? So we don't want to go straight into that blue light. We want to get rid of that. We want to come down. We may just have silence in our mind. I think that's really important, that the mindfulness. I think that these are really big things to teach our adolescents and our kids early on how to rest and relax and digest good quality food.
Sure. So look, I love your tips. You said so. Avoid the simple carbs. Get sleep. Relax. Stay away from the devices. Relax could be mindfulness meditation. It could be just closing your eyes. It could be just sitting outside in the sun. Lots of different ways to do that. But avoid the stimulation to let us come down. And then you were about to say something else before I cut you off.
Yeah, no, there's other things. There's the hot and cold. It's almost having a look at what works for you as an individual. And I think journaling can be a really good thing for some of the things that we've kind of said, is goal setting, but then also journaling on how you feel post game, coming into the game. So if you're a little bit anxious coming into the game, then there's something that you can talk to your parents, or you can go to reputable kind of resources to help reduce that. After the game, how you felt. Are you fatigued? Okay, why are you fatigued? If you construct why you're fatigued in soccer, tends to be maybe, that repeat sprint has gone up recently. So what are you doing preparing for that? So I'd always look at that, not just recovery for recovery's sake, because actually you may not be conditioned well. So that's why your poor recovery may be coming in, or your diet's not as good recently. Processed carbs and oils and that sort of thing can have a big effect on our body. So.
Sure. I'm hearing a theme is like, not everything you've talked about is do it for a reason. It sounds like we don't just fail for failure's sake. We don't just do recovery for recovery's sake. We don't just lift weights for lifting weights' sake. There has to be a purpose behind it.
Yeah. And that's where the psychology comes in, because it's easy to take shortcuts. As humans, we want to take shortcuts. We want the rewards before, we've worked hard for it. And stacking habits. My wife always says to our boys, stack positives. If the other ways, if you write on your journal, I had a processed carb here, I got on my phone here, I was anxious about this here, that sort of thing, you'll kind of you stack compromises. And I think that's the big one. British Cycling talked about marginal gains and the aggregation of marginal gains, so all the 1%ers. But I see in athletes, and this from the bottom to the top, is we have the aggregation of compromises. I really want to get better, but actually I don't want to do all the small stuff.
Sure.
And they add up.
Yeah.
So.
I call that want versus desire.
Absolutely.
So I want to be able to play the guitar, but I've picked it up 3 times in my life, played it for about 30 minutes, put it down and said, this is too hard. But if I really desired to play the guitar, then I would not play games on my phone, and I would spend time on the guitar, and I wouldn't spend time watching TV, and I'd spend time on the guitar. And we have a lot of wanters, but not all as desirers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Intrinsic versus extrinsic and that sort of thing. So yeah, absolutely.
Sure. You started to talk about the hot and the cold. Do you have any specific advice for youth athletes, cold tubs, hot, when to do heat, when to do cold? And again, I know there has to be a purpose behind it. It made me think of, I was in Scandinavia in high school running on a track team, and they had these saunas, and then they were right on the edge of a very, very cold sea, and they would sit in the sauna, and then they'd take a plunge into the cold water, and then they'd go back in the sauna. And this is the only place I've ever seen this. So talk to me about heat versus cold, when to do which, how long to do it for. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, no, there's just so much research coming out about this. And yeah, I've been to Europe and been lucky enough to do the saunas and then into the lake and that sort of thing. If you think about like why they did it, they tend to have done it for health, and then it's gone over to sport. As anything, sport kind of takes from different things. They take from medical and that sort of thing. But if you think about heat, you get that vasodilation. So the vascular system really dilates and opens up, okay? Because it wants to push the blood towards the skin to cool the skin and that sort of thing. So you're getting that flexibility in the vascular system. And then when you jump into the cold, then it constricts. So you're getting this really good range or flexibility. If you're just looking at that, you can look at the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. But I mean, if you just look at the vascular health, you know that if you leave your hose out and not use it all summer, then you go to use it and there's normally holes, or it cracks, or it goes hard. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, look, the vascular system is not as cheap as a garden hose, but it's a similar thing. You want to have that range of vascularity or that flexibility. So, when you're in a soccer match, you're able to dilate really, really well. Look, the cold, I come from a bit of a school of, I think the body really recovers well by itself. If you do all the really good thing, nutrition and that sort of thing, I think it can recover really well. If you want to accelerate that, then what you're going to do is compromise some of the adaptations. So, and I think this is a really important one for players and athletes that are coming into their adolescence. They have really high hormonal levels that will really, human growth hormone. You see a young boy or girl kind of fall over and graze their knee, and in 3 days it's not there. Whereas in our 30s, 40s, 50s, it tends to last a week, 2 weeks. So, but in saying that, if you have a congested schedule, then cold can definitely work. But again, it's going to negate those adaptations that you're trying to get. But yeah, look, people used to say you have to go in really, really cold. I think it's around 55 degrees is still okay, where people were kind of trying to do high 30s and 40s. That's probably a mental thing. I've seen really good studies for around about 10 to 14 minutes will reduce a lot of inflammation and that sort of thing. Again, I just wouldn't go towards where it's mentally scarring or mentally hard. It should be, look, it's cold, but it shouldn't hurt and that sort of thing. So
sure, okay. Yeah. What about I'm seeing all over Facebook, and I apologize, I don't remember the name of it, but this little, it's like a massaging device that kind of hits your muscles really really fast. Whatever that thing is called, is that thing helpful? Because they are marketing the heck out of that to parents right now.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. It's kind of growing like weeds in professional sport. I think from like a low level, I think it should be fine. But if you've got a really tight muscle, it's probably tight for a reason. The nervous system is making that muscle tight because it actually doesn't want you to use it until it recovers. So if you get some of these that do 2,400 jabs per minute, then you're probably just bashing the muscle and probably causing some damage there and that sort of thing. So I think at low levels, all the speeds and not too hard, I think it's fine. I would encourage a normal massage if you can do that. So there's self-massaging techniques and that sort of thing. So then you can regulate the pain and that sort of thing. I've found from personal, and I always try and do it, and I'm a lot older than some of our athletes, but I always come out sorer from that. And I used to talk to some of the athletes in the NFL, and they used to say, "Coach, you need to stretch after that." So I tried stretching after it and that sort of thing. So it helped a little bit, but I still was just as sore. So there's no really good fundamental research out there, Sam, for that helping.
Sure. And some of the things are probably a placebo or a mental effect, right? As long as we're not hurting ourselves, if you think it's helping, then as long as like I said, you're not hurting yourself. If you think it's helping, it might. I think of the magic spray that they use in soccer matches, right? Or football matches, right? So all of a sudden, the spray them and they're magically fixed and they're back on the pitch. So. Right.
Yeah. I grew up with the magic sponge. The magic sponge would come out and you would jump up. But I think that's a really good point. In a lot of my accreditations, and one of my latest one with the Australian Exercise and Sport Science, they have a high performance manager accreditation, and the fundamental thing is thou shall not harm, and I think that goes along with what you're saying in terms of the placebo. If it doesn't harm the athlete, then that's fine, but that's the fundamental ethics that we follow. So
for sure. You started to talk about stretching after the massage. Now this is something that has drastically changed since I was a child participating in sports, where we did, as a group, we would do this very static stretching before sports. And then sometimes you do the static stretching again after competing in sports. Now, I don't see much warm-up at all. I do see some dynamic warm-ups and very skill-specific things in certain sports. In soccer, I think soccer does a pretty good job of warming up. I don't see cool-down at all in any sports at the youth level anymore. So what should kids be doing? What are the do's and don'ts in terms of warm up, stretching, and cooling down?
Yeah, great question, because it changes all the time. It really does. The research, and it's certain research groups will really advocate static stretching. The others will be dynamic stretching. Current practices for us is light aerobic exercise to get blood into the muscles and that sort of thing, and then go up to really specific. And I think it's working up over a time. It's just making sure that you do enough and don't do too much. And I know that's quite general, but again, I think that comes down to the individual and journaling and see how you feel. I've measured an international rugby player. I watched a player and I thought, wow, he's doing way too much. And it was interesting. I had the luxury of the GPS and heart rate, and he was virtually, the rugby's played in two halves like football. He was doing virtually an extra half for his warm up. So, wow. Yeah, so we had to change that a lot to like it was like a 14-minute warm up, where before he was doing like a 40+ minute warm up. But yeah, I like dynamic stretching. I think dynamic stretching, moving through the ranges that you're going to do. And then in the warm-ups is increase that bandwidth. So encouraging players or giving them the opportunity, or where you're coaching, is to get into awkward situations. We do these nice straight line warm-ups and different things, and then we do these nice skips in soccer. You see they do the skips and stuff like that. Is, you want them to do very similar to what they're going to do in the game. So
Okay.
I think that's a big one. I like the cool down, but it just depends on your culture. When I came from rugby to the NFL, we had to be on the plane within 60 minutes. So we really couldn't do a lot of a cool down, because guys are getting their gear off and getting changed and showered, and then the next thing we're on the bus. So, it's within the constraints of what you're doing too. But I like to see a cool down if you can. I think the cardiovascular system welcomes it.
Okay. Let's say you do have to jump in a car on a bus. Are you able to do a cool down hours later, or is it too late at that point?
Yeah, look, we'd like to move and that sort of thing. I think if it's almost like, when you get onto a plane and they teach you about like moving around and different things. I think if you can do some of those, especially at the lower leg, gravity is going to pull that blood and pull, the blood towards the lower legs. If you have, compression stockings and stuff like that, I think they can work too. Like if you can't move, I would say that, because you want to push that blood back up into the heart and kind of process that there. And then if you're getting into a car and that sort of thing, or a bus, then that can reduce the inflammation in the lower leg as well. For compression stockings, I think you can get that from, a lot of the sporting shops and that sort of thing. I think they're quite good.
So when Dr. Beard calls them stockings, that's Australian for socks. For our listeners. So.
Yeah, I'm getting better at a lot of things, but not everything.
So compression socks, great. So, one of the most amazing impacts I've seen you have personally, Adam, is on injury prevention and reducing injury rates at some of the places you've been. So talk to our listeners about, what are some of the things that a high performance director might do that could apply to youth or adolescent athletes from an injury prevention standpoint? What suggestions do you have there?
Yeah. The things that we looked at, like these days, I've got a lot of technologies, but when I started in the industry, we didn't. We just kind of had film and you counted. And the big thing is I would encourage is to do some movement analysis. And it's quite easy. You can get a piece of paper and count the number of sprints. You may even count the length of some of those sprints. And look, that's not going to be perfect, but you can easily say, oh, that was about 20 yards, and that looked 100%. So you kind of record it. And if you can understand physically what the game gives you, then you can prepare for that. And I think that's a big one, where a lot of people, and we get this load management these days. I think that's never going to prepare you for the game. So you're going to get injured. And it's something that when, I was with you in the NFL, we came along and we were getting a lot of injuries before I came. And it was almost like, what's the coach going to do in practice? What's the coach going to do during the week? And try and construct, what we're going to do there. Look, there's a lot of strength training exercises and stuff like that. But if I'm honest, hamstrings, for instance, they're the number one in soccer, the NFL, MLB, everywhere. Their hamstrings are a very fast twitch fiber. They don't like to repeat. So you really can do a little bit in the weight room, but actually you need to do it running. You need to sprint. So it's almost you get a vaccine by doing what you need to do. So, and then that is just working up slowly to that. When you can't increase volume by 100%. We kind of a magic number, and it's not magic, but 10 to 15% increase, week on week. So that's the kind of things that I normally do is look at. Okay, so one, what does a sport produce? What kind of injuries? What do we do that may cause those injuries? And then how can we mitigate those?
Great.
It's like brushing. It's like brushing your teeth. You know, if you want clean teeth, you're gonna have to brush your teeth. If you want healthy hamstrings, you need to sprint. And it's kind of that simple in a way. There's no magic formula. There really isn't.
Well, you certainly have done a great job in that area. So I'd argue that it's probably a little bit more complex than you're making it seem. You're being awfully humble because I see a lot, as you mentioned, a lot of hamstring injuries, a lot of soft tissue injuries in general, and and I think you've done a great job of reducing those. And many people say that the majority of soft tissue injuries are preventable.
Yeah, they're lying to you, unfortunately. Like that, you know, look, some are. You can.
They're trying to sell me. They're trying to sell me a load management system or something, right?
Yeah. Look, from what I can see, especially at the top level, is you'll get, you know, these gurus outside saying, you know, I've worked in a sport and I had no injuries, or you know, soft tissue injuries are completely preventable. Well, it's kind of coming from the people that are not in the arena. It's coming from the cheap seats of, hey, if I was in your position, there'd be no injuries. Really?
Yeah, you know, and you'd be in my position.
Yeah, and I think you can do all of the things, you know, and mitigate. Like, I remember the NFL, the owner used to always pester me for, hey, we've got to be hydrated. We've got to be hydrated. This is why we're getting soft tissue injuries. And, you know, I turned to him and said, well, why aren't we injured? You know, because we're dehydrated. We've been out here for 2.5 hours. Like, all the coaches are dehydrated. It's because we don't sprint. And look, I think the hydration is very important. So please don't think that I'm saying that, but you have to sprint, because if you're dehydrated, you're more likely not to get that. The muscle needs to be fueled, but if you're not sprinting, you probably won't get a hamstring injury.
So if you want to, so basically you have to practice the skills that you're going to need on game day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, makes sense.
And I think this might be a little bit controversial, but like when you and I were growing up playing sport, we probably played or had practice when we were dehydrated. And these days, the players have to be perfectly hydrated all the time. Mm-hmm. And I kind of think that reduces the bandwidth for resiliency. And I think sometimes, in a controlled environment, then you might not completely dehydrated, but not as perfectly hydrated as everything. Like, the kids these days carry a water bottle everywhere. Mm-hmm. Like, everywhere. It's almost like attached to them here, and there's the phone in the other hand. So
yeah, interesting. So I'm glad you brought that up. So that makes me think of electrolytes and sports drinks. You know, my one kid is a horrible water drinker, but boy, does he love the Gatorades and, you know, the sports drinks and, you know, and all this out there. And so, you know, what general advice do you have in terms of sports drinks after, before, you know, salt, electrolytes? We don't need to pick on any brand per se, but just in general, you know, what advice do you have for kids who are athletes?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, some of these sport drinks can be really good. You know, I mean, there's a lot of really good research and that sort of thing. Even, you know, we have to have a look at the muscle uptakes a lot of these, you know, these simple carbohydrates and that. Mm-hmm. If you know, we're well trained. If we're not as well trained, I don't think they work as well. Look, there's kind of the composition of salt, potassium, all these electrolytes and that sort of thing. Normally, these are very well researched, so they normally have pretty good compositions. So I kind of wouldn't tend to go outside that. But I think, you know, the overconsumption of these sports drinks, you know, while they've got a lot better, if you go back to the Los Angeles Olympics, we didn't really know about it, and this is where a lot of these came out, and a lot of these track and field athletes, gained 5 and 10 pounds over kind of like a week, and they didn't perform as well. So I would say that a lot of these are empty calories. They can be good around the game. I just would discourage it throughout the week, and that sort of thing. I don't think that you need them all the time, and they're very sweet on our teeth and that sort of thing. So, if your boy is having some of these, maybe just rinsing his mouth and stuff like with water, gets that sugar off the teeth and that sort of thing. I think that's quite important. There's some research on that as well. So.
Okay. So there are some good products out there, and again, we don't, we won't bash any bad ones, but there are some good products out there and some good science behind it. Better to use around competition time as opposed to during the week. And then what about before games versus after games? Is there I'd assume after for recovery is better than prior to?
Yeah, well, prior to depends on the athlete. So, a lot of the athletes struggle eating prior to games and that sort of thing. So simple carbohydrates and that sort of thing. It's a bit of a trial and error. We normally survey our players to see how they go and try and kind of get a good routine at practices and that sort of thing. And then once they understand themselves in practice, then we tend to use the same, process for the game. Yeah, definitely post game. I think you can definitely have some. It's just having a look at the ingredients. Like some of these, drinks can be upward 40, 50, 60 grams of carbohydrates, which is quite high. So
sure. Yeah, very, very helpful. And we're about to wrap up. So if you're listening live and you have a question, please drop it in the chat, and we'll ask Dr. Beard your question. So as we're winding down, one of my main takeaways, Adam, is that, you've mentioned this a few times. I think it's a very individualized thing. And one of the best ways to figure out what works or doesn't work for you is to keep a log or a journal and to really chart what you're doing in terms of not just your workouts, but what are you doing before the training or before the game? What are you doing after? How do you feel? And then you're starting to look for themes, it sounds like, and coming up with your own recipe for pre-game, during game, and post-game.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about that that mindset. Like to be able to be open to things. And I think if you can construct or go through what works and what doesn't, and gain advice of creditable people, I think that's going to expedite. And I'm always that's my big thing, is how can I expedite your performance? And I think it's asking the hard questions of yourself, your coaches, and that sort of thing. How can I be more efficient? And stacking habits. I think that's a big one.
Sure. Oh, here comes a question. So there's a question on from Jennifer. Do you have any tips for maintaining health of the knees for a catcher? So you have a catcher is squatting a lot, and this is a 18-year-old, but I'm sure we can answer the question generally. So I'm sure you've seen this at the Major League Baseball level, Adam, either in the minors or in the majors. What advice do you have for that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because they're in really difficult, situations and positions for long periods. I think making sure that we maintain tissue health. So, we talked about before percussion. I think we kind of talked about that. I'd stay away from that as much, but foam rollers, massage, self-massage, I think is really important to keep that integrity of the tissue around the knee. Making sure that the other things like ankle mobility, so we look at the kinetic chain, the ankle mobility really needs to be maintained, because if the ankle's not mobile, then the knee's probably going to have to take the brunt of some of that. So I would say ankle mobility is really, really important, and hip mobility and strength is really important as well. So that would be my biggest advice.
Okay, so things that I think a lot of people, and certainly me, didn't think of, which makes sense. It's all connected. The ankle and the hip, to focus on those in addition to the knee.
Yeah, well, the knee is a stability joint. If you
Mm-hmm.
kind of look at mobility and stability, the ankle is a mobility thing. We need to increase the mobility of our ankle, and as we age, we tend to get less or more rigid. The knee needs to be stable, and the hip needs to be more mobile. So, around the knee joint, you need to make sure those two are mobile, so the knee doesn't have to take on extra mobility. So.
Sure. So what are some practical things people could do to increase ankle and hip mobility?
Yeah, no, it's really good. There's so ankle mobility. So there's things like knee to wall exercises and that sort of thing. Look, it's hard to kind of verbalize it, but I would say you can go on to YouTube and stuff like that, and put in ankle mobility, and you'll get lots of different exercises and really credible.
Okay.
I don't know if they're going to mean anything. Me just kind of throwing up some names of exercises.
Okay, no worries. What about the spelling the alphabet with your ankle in the air? That's one that was taught to me. I don't know if there's good science behind that one or not. But when you're sitting in your chair in class in school, to put your leg out and to draw the letters in the air with each ankle, and then go from regular to cursive and etc.
Yeah, that will get some good kind of mobility strength. I think probably in this one, because they're in contact with the ground, there's some good exercises that they could do with the ankle on the ground. Like they've got things like putting kettlebells on the knee, or small weights on the knee to push that. You might foam roll the lower calf and that sort of thing to get that tissue quality, and then to be able to increase that range over time. So
great. So we have another question from James, and I think we may devote a future entire episode to this topic of ACLs, but we have you here, and so I'd love to ask you the question. So James says women tend to have ACL/knee issues. Men do as well, but women do tend to have them at a higher rate. Anything to consider for stretching or workouts that should be considered to help reduce knee or ACL injuries?
Yeah, no, this is a pandemic in sport, and especially as we kind of allude to with women. Look, in terms of basic, really good strength training, I think it's really important. Strengthening hamstrings is a really good preventable, especially in the eccentrics. Look, there is some really good position papers on this, and I would encourage you to go to Google Scholar and just put in ACL prevention. I know the soccer in the UK has the preventative 6, I think, exercises. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but that's a really good one that they've put in, and it's reducing ACLs and that sort of thing. So,
and if I can find it, we'll we'll put a link to that in the replay.
Yeah, I can send some links.
Well.
I think some of these things is, I can definitely push some links to some of the listeners and viewers, for sure.
That's great. So if you are watching this via replay or on our podcast, there will be some links available for you that we'll put on the Ilovetowatchyouplay.com website. Well, Dr. Beard, thank you so much. I jotted a whole bunch of notes down, and I was talking to my co-host Asia before we started, and it's kind of our measure. No pressure for future guests, but that's kind of our measure for how informative the guest was by how many notes that we take. And so I wrote a lot down. So it was certainly informative for me, and I'm sure it was informative for our listeners. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule in season to talk to us and And go Cubs.
No worries. Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it. Yep. Let's go Cubs.
All right. Take care.
See ya.